Kevin Allen is a fourth-generation Calgarian and the author of Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary, which was published in 2018. The book has just been announced as a finalist in the International Next Generation Indie Book Awards. Kevin has been documenting and profiling queer people and events for 25 years through freelance writing and editing for various queer publications, and now he is the founder of the Gay History Project, a research team that continues the work that he started in 2012 that led to the book. Kevin is a career arts administrator and the past executive director of the Alberta Media Arts Alliance. He is also one of the founders of Calgary's largest queer nonprofit organizations, the Fairy Tales Presentation Society, which produces many cultural events, including the very successful Fairy Tales Film Festival every year in May. After reading his book, I am so pleased that I get the chance to talk to Kevin about some of the fascinating and important stories he's highlighted from Calgary's history. Kevin, thank you for joining me. I'm wondering, my very first question is actually if you could set the scene for us in terms of Pride Month. There's a very specific history to Pride Month that mostly comes from the United States, but it also impacts us here in Canada and in Calgary. Could you set the scene for me about where it comes from?
Yeah, so June has become a sort of international month of pride around the world, and it's really centered around the Stonewall riots that happened in June 1969, 51 years ago, I guess. And Canada honors those Stonewall riots, and actually Calgary's first Pride parades happened in June, and now we're in the Labor Day weekend in September. But for the first chapter in Pride's history, it was always in June to commemorate Pride Month. And so it's nice to see all the rainbows that appear and programming that appears, like the Glenbow asking me to talk about Pride. It's good.
It is a convenient way of marking time, I think, by sort of honoring points in history and also like just celebratory events that it gives us an opportunity to talk about stuff that we don't get to talk about.
Well, our community has some issues around visibility, having been historically invisible, and also around shame. So Pride is the flip side of that. So it's really resonant for people in the LGBTQ2 community.
Yeah, that's actually worth talking about too, because the very idea of pride as the word is very purposeful in the sense of it is meant to overturn the idea of being closeted or being shameful or having it being gay being wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's sort of fundamental to the core of the Pride movement. That's how it all came about.
So here we are in Pride Month, and we are talking about your book, Our Past Matters. Can you tell me a little bit about why you started the Calgary Gay History Project and how it manifested into the book?
So I fell into history sort of by accident. In 2012, Calgary was the city of culture. There was a national program, and CADA, Calgary Development, was running grants of different kinds of artists in residence and historians in residence. And I guess I've sort of, had a passing interest in history, as just most curious people do. And I thought, where were gay people in Calgary before I was born? My parents are from Calgary. I'm from Calgary. And I talked to them one evening on like a Sunday night at dinner, and my mom joked there were no gay people. And then my father said he knew not to drink at the Palliser Hotel. There was a tavern underneath called the King's Arms, and a lot of gay men drank there. And so he didn't want to be guilty by association, and he knew about that. And so that got me really interested. So I applied for this tiny little seed grant, to be a historian in residence at Community Wise, which is the old Y on 12th Avenue, where historically a lot of queer organizations have been. And I uncovered this really interesting history, and then I became an addict. And then people were interested in the findings and demanded a book. And so I sort of followed my community's orders a little bit and produced one for them.
Well, it's a really good book. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And it just sort of illustrated something that's been on my mind a lot about who gets to decide history and then who gets to tell it and what stories are remembered. And I think that with the Calgary Gay History Project, you've surfaced a lot of stories that otherwise would have been forgotten or would have been lost. And I think that they're not just relevant to the gay community. I think as I was reading the book, I was thoroughly engrossed in the stories of these individuals and these periods in history that have been so dramatic and so close to home. So it's really interesting to, as we all, I think we're going through a period where people are starting to question who gets to tell history. So I'm curious about that perspective from you.
Absolutely. So I do I have a bit of an activist past, which I think I brought to the history project. Insofar as once I started researching Calgary history generally, as well as trying to find the stories of Calgary's gay history, I really felt there was this dominant narrative in Calgary about oil exploration, about the Calgary Stampede, and those two notes kind of like really defined the city, and it became sort of my mission to challenge that narrative and talk about other stories. And people who read the book often tell me, particularly straight people, they can't believe all this was going on under their noses, that there was this whole other world, like, because their city was sort of on this level, and yet there's other cities. And I think it's not just for the queer community. I think there's probably other communities who have different stories and different histories that, you know, make up what the contemporary Calgary is. And so, yeah, it's important for me to sort of bring these stories out of the shadows and claim our space in the history narrative. And I just want to add something. And in Canada too, Calgary, the prairies are just really glossed over in queer history. And so it was also a way of kind of saying we were here too, you know, and we did our own things and they were important.
Yeah, and that's actually the perfect next segue, because that is really an interesting thing. And I mean, it's something that we find at Glenbow too, is that telling local stories and stories of artists and history that represent this part of the world are so important because you know, you can talk about that sort of unique Western identity and it becomes a bit of a trope or a political hot potato. But we genuinely have a unique perspective because of the place that we live and the experiences that we've had and the fact that we are further away from big centers, and that we've sort of made our own path in a lot of communities. Every community that's come, you know, every group has come to this part of the world and then made their own path. So the stories you illustrate really are interesting because they interweave Calgary's history and Alberta's history within that larger global context and really show how things that were happening around the world and in bigger cities and in cities where there were more people in the gay community sort of working together, how that trickled out to the West and how not only did it trickle out, but things that happened here influenced events on a larger stage.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, Calgary's gay history is gay, but it's also very Calgarian. Like, there are some sort of cultural mores or maybe even stereotypes about Calgarians that even filtered through into our queer history. Like, for one thing is we don't wait for permission often to do things. And so Calgary, our gay elders really mobilized their energies and came together in a way that was pretty innovative in the country. And like our early club gay bars and gay spaces. And there's also this sort of communalism aspect that happens on the prairies where the spaces were intended to be nurturing spaces as opposed to, you know, maybe political spaces. So those two things I noted, I connected to sort of Calgary culture versus gay culture within our community.
And there's a few sort of really trailblazing stories, or at least stories that are centered around that really illustrate the idea of that the gay community has always been here. It's just not always been present it's been hidden.
Yeah.
The Shaun the Rock history is really interesting. Could you talk a little bit about him as a character in Alberta's history?
Sure. So I was so delighted to discover Shaun the Rock at the Glenbow Archives. There was just a veiled reference to kind of like sexual inappropriateness with this character from Calgary's past. It's actually before Calgary existed as a city. He was a French Canadian missionary, basically, or he wanted to be a missionary. He went to seminary school in Montreal in the mid 1800s when he was a young man, and got kicked out for inappropriate sexual practices. He was caught in bed with another male seminary student. And so he kind of moved out west, and the same sort of scandal followed him all around Alberta. And he became nomadic and really aligned himself with the Siksika, the Blackfoot, and became the most fluent Blackfoot speaker in the territory. We were the Northwest Territories then, still not Alberta. And when Treaty 7 was going to be signed, the lieutenant governor at the time tapped him on the shoulder as the best Siksika speaker to translate on behalf of the Crown. And he said, no, I'm translating on behalf of the chiefs, who are my close personal friends. And so he found a community in our local First Nations because they didn't have the cultural baggage and prohibitions around gender identity and sexual orientation that sort of settler culture did. And so there was a space for him in this other society, which also needs to be talked about more and explored. And it's at the founding of, Southern Alberta colonial culture.
Lots to talk about there. We can write about, endless books, I think, that you have on your list now at this point. I was also really intrigued by the story of the court system and the fact that was a uniquely Western thing that sort of sprung up locally, coming from San Francisco and the States. But maybe you could talk about that.
Definitely a West Coast thing, though. Yeah, so the court system is this very elaborate drag royalty system that we have. So there's emperors and empresses elected every year in Calgary, and it's our longest continuous queer organization in the city. They formed in 1977, and they've been going strong ever since. So they have these pageants and special events, and it's all based around fundraising. So they've supported the community, the peer support organizations and aid service organizations and all those things throughout the years. But there's this sort of drag culture in North America that every city has their own chapter, and Calgary's has a proud history. And it was really poo-pooed in central Canada, years later when Toronto journalists came out to report on the gay scene in Calgary. But eventually they now have their courts too, and they elect their empresses and emperors, but we're older.
I mean, how could you resist having emperors and empresses dressed up in fabulous outfits, leading parades?
Yeah, and those people were brave in a way because, cross-dressing or being gender non-conforming is always a trigger for, or has been historically, for the dominant culture. And so drag queens at the head of pride parades often would, face violence, and sometimes would be, in Calgary's history, be violent back, bash people over the head with their scepter, that kind of thing. So in those early years.
There are some really, really good stories in your book. The other one that sort of floated to the surface to me was actually the history of the University of Calgary and in trans history in terms of leading the way medically.
Right. Okay. So that was so when you're a historian, you're sometimes just searching through stacks and stacks of things and just stumble across something. And this was one of those stories where I had no idea, but in the 70s, Calgary had a gender clinic based at the Foothills Hospital, and they were one of the leading gender dysphoria clinics in the country. And so Canadians from across the country would move to Calgary because they'd only their patients had to be Albertans, and so people would relocate to come and get medical attention, surgery, psychiatric assessments, and that to begin gender transition. And the very first national trans publication was started here in Calgary in 1978. It was called Gender Review, by a very famous trans male activist, Rupert Raj, who pioneered a lot of trans organizations in the country. He didn't stay here very long, but and it's unclear why the gender clinic disappeared over time. But yeah, for one point in the late 70s, early 80s, we had this constellation of doctors, nurses, psychiatrists who were all really interested in this issue.
So interesting. One of the things that made your book really current for me was that it shows how much can be achieved when people overcome isolation. I think in the context of the COVID-19 lockdown, when all of us are feeling isolated and cut off from our communities and our loved ones and our families, it really became so present and relevant to me in the sense of the history of gay people in Calgary and Alberta finding each other and breaking out of isolation is so important to what came next. And that creation of networks and community building and achieving things together is super inspiring and really interesting. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that history, about finding each other.
So isolationism, a dominant theme in queer history. For most of the 20th century, people who identified as LGBTQ2 had a hard time finding each other. There weren't even people, it wasn't talked about in polite society. People didn't even know the word homosexual or gay for a good chunk of the century. And so people thought they were just sort of isolated freaks at home. And so when they started to find each other, they formed community, and the community was very tight. The very first club in Calgary, Club Carousel, had hundreds of members, even though homosexuality had been recently decriminalized and there was still a lot of social pressure against it. People would come out several times a week just to, this is a quote, let their hair down, live in a world where they didn't have to always be performing as straight, and connect. So humans need other humans, and it's a truth. And things like the early Club Carousel seeded other clubs all across the prairies, and sort of it created this blossoming of a community because people found each other.
There's a history. I think one of the other interesting things about the book is that it shows that there is a long and strong history of activism in Calgary. And I think often we forget that. Those of us who have benefited from activism from our elders often forget that it takes a lot of work to make gains socially and politically, and that it often takes protesting and action and the history of that activism in the gay community, both in Calgary and around the world, is both tragic, but it's also joyous in terms of people really achieving incredible things. And I think that's one of the things that also felt like a parallel to our life right now, and because it's illustrating the power of activism and protest and people stepping up and fighting for what they believe in. There was a quote from the book that I wondered if you could sort of illuminate. AIDS made activists out of those who in gentler times would have been wallflowers and fence sitters.
Yeah, so, I mean, when you're a discriminated community, and there's shame, like we talked about earlier with regard to pride, there's a sort of reluctance to act. But action is what sets you free. And so in Calgary, when AIDS, the pandemic, an earlier pandemic hit, and men who had sex with men, gay and bisexual men predominantly were the most affected. They were dying in huge numbers in Calgary. It made people really militant. Like if you were sick yourself with HIV or dying, or you had good friends or family members who were dying, it tore you off the fence. Like people were back in the early 90s, people were losing their jobs, getting evicted. Like the discrimination, I remember it, I was a young adult then, was in your face. It was overt. Like people could be awful to you, and sort of that was the dominant culture. And so it made people really militant, and they needed to stand up for the rights because the stakes were so high. It couldn't get any higher. Your life was literally on the line. That said, activists in our community are always a minority of the community. Like I think I could say our rights were gained by a courageous few, as opposed to sort of the entire community rising up. Stephen Locke, who was one of the most outspoken gay activists in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Calgary, like the go-to person to speak to from the media, he always talks about having a silver dollar bruise on his shoulder right here from all the gay men and women who come up to him in gay bars and like poke at him and say, "You don't speak for me. Why are you rocking the boat? What?" And just so within our community, there was a lot of resistance to activism. People just wanted to kind of get by, not get their heads chopped off, sort of thing. So we really have to thank those courageous few who were out and proud and demanding change.
I think actually that's another thing that the book I found really effective in the book is that you, in your history, in finding all these histories and in surfacing these stories, I thought you did a really good job of paying attention to the fact that there are multiple kinds of voices within the gay community. It's not just one monolith. It's not just one movement. There are so many other perspectives, and listening to those different voices are a way of making the history richer and more important, because it's just a more encompassing story. It tells more perspectives. And there were a few stories that actually highlighted that for me, especially. Could you talk about a few of those?
Sure. So one thing I've noticed in studying queer history is that there's certain voices that are more dominant than other voices. Gay male voices, for example, and lesbian voices, to be fair, are really strong in the sort of historical narrative. But the bisexuals seem to be missing. Transgender history is really hard to discover. Two-spirit history is more underground, less surface than some of these other histories. And so with the idea that queer history is quieter than non-queer history, I also think that within our umbrella, there's other histories that need to be advanced. I've been doing a lot of work this year with trans history and working with trans Calgarians about sort of recovering their stories. It's important that you get people who have these identities to share their voices too, so that you don't just, filter it through history through your own eyes. One of the stories I love, and it's got a Glenbow connection, is the Of Color Collective. This was a group of queers of color in the 90s who came together to combat racism within the queer community. And they were political agitators and often got a lot of pushback from the white queer community of Calgary, who didn't want to think about privilege or structural racism. These words that we're throwing around today with much more understanding, actually. Back in the 90s, these were sort of new terms that were being introduced and maybe falling clunkily down into the public forum of ideas. And but the Of Color group was really courageous, and they produced a film festival in the mid-90s. The very first one was 1995, called The Fire Had Become, and they rented the Glenbow Theatre in downtown Calgary. And social conservatives who were much more vociferous about being anti-gay at the time really protested. In the 90s, there was this sort of cultural war about anything that had queer content that was publicly supported with a grant or public funding was really condemned. And so this minister, a social conservative religious leader in Calgary, got on the horn, contacted 200 other churches, did this letter writing, phone calling campaign, and really attacked the Glenbow for hosting this film festival, which they said was smutty and restricted, and not supporting their values. And politicians chimed in, and the Glenbow, of course, wanting to be a responsible organization and not really liking all this heat that was getting from the community, was concerned and contemplated pulling the festival. But they decided to have a community meeting with the organizers, and so the organizers quickly, we didn't have email back then, which is shocking to think, called, there's a phone tree, and people said, we have to meet at Glenbow at 3:00 this afternoon. And so they managed to get about 50 people there for the meeting, people from the arts community, people from the queer community. And there were 3 Glenbow executives, I believe, who let everyone speak. And they said, we have to make a decision. Since there's so many of you, you stay here, we'll go out of the room. And they conferred for 10 minutes, and they came back and said, we'll let the festival go ahead. And so they made this very courageous stand when their funding was being threatened, it was being threatened. And the festival went ahead. And I remember going to that festival as a young adult and crossing picket lines to get to the festival. But one of the good things about controversy is everyone knows about it. The festival was sold out every day. There were picketers. There was a sort of defiant gay community that came out for it and support. And the furor went away. And I don't think the Glenbow was financially affected, thankfully. But thanks to the Glenbow, who stood up for the queer community when it was maybe not as easy to do so.
I do like that story selfishly, but there are also really good stories in the book about other arts and culture organizations, particularly theater groups who fronted voices of queer culture in the 90s, especially, and similar patterns emerged of conservative voices trying to shout them down, but then the controversy working out well for the arts organization and selling out the tickets. And I thought that was really interesting, an interesting sort of narrative. I mean, at least I sort of assume that arts and culture are often very important to cultural movements and protests, but it is interesting to see how there's almost a double benefit there, because controversy often gets attention that's both positive and negative.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the controversy would shut down queer events, but as time progressed and we became more confident as a community, then the maybe balance of power shifted. And but there's lots of stories in Calgary's history, theater history in particular, where we had these voices, these really rabid voices of social conservative religious leaders and political leaders. And I wonder what they think about their statements now in the context of history, how offside it looks in 2020.
That's a very interesting question, because of course now we're living in this very fraught time of cancel culture when people can be very afraid of saying the wrong thing. And there's it's affecting so many things in public discourse. It's hard to sort of reflect on in the moment, but I think that will be an interesting thing to look back on as historians and cultural producers, and think about what it means to speak up or not speak up, or say something wrong and then have your mind changed or not changed. I mean, it's interesting times. Speaking of interesting times, now your book sort of takes us through the late 1800s all the way through the 1990s in terms of Calgary's history. But of course, there's more to the story, because we've all lived through more. I mean, things are changing even now. There's history happening right now, both in the gay community and in so many other communities, especially marginalized communities. Can you talk about collecting history as an active activity?
Yeah, sure. So one of the big missions of this project is to preserve and save these stories, and that includes contemporary history as well. So we record our interviews. We take donations of materials, and it's all going to be accessioned, likely in the Glenbow collection at the University of Calgary. The History Project has about 20 boxes worth of material of stuff, and it's not just me. There's about half a dozen researchers from all different backgrounds who have worked with the collection and are cataloging things and researching things. My priority really, I don't know if it's selfish, but the thing that is most keeping me up at night is getting the stories from our elders. So people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s whose stories are going to disappear just because they're long-lived. We haven't really started working on that much on 21st century history yet. Partly because it's lived history. I noticed when I was writing the book, most of the century was a research project, but once I got to the 90s, that was my lived adult history. And I noticed myself interjecting myself, like all of a sudden I became part of the story in a weird way. Like it became a first person thing versus a third person thing. And so that's an interesting development. So if I talk about, the 21st century, I'm right in the thick of things there too.
One more question that I forgot to ask you. One of the other, so many interesting things. One of the things that struck me in the book is that you speak about, in the afterword, about how language has shifted and how words change, their meaning changes over time, and how the usage of them really genuinely matters, and how you spoke of elders and how their perspective on language is very different from yours or for someone who might be growing up now in the community. Can you talk a little bit about language and how you discovered that it can be a thorny thing?
Yeah, it's so true, particularly in our community, and with the acronym that is like expanding and contracting, and language is really important in our community. So when I started the project, I called it the Calgary Queer History Project. I really like queer. Queer is a word that came was reclaimed as a word of power in the early 90s around the AIDS pandemic, and that's when I came of age. But when I started interviewing people who were gray-haired, let's say, in Calgary, our elders, they were really resistant to talking to me because I called it the Calgary Queer History Project, and queer for them in the 50s and 60s and even 70s was a pejorative. It was an insult. It was something that maybe is like the F word to me. Now, if someone says that to me, it really makes me go crazy. That word hasn't been reclaimed as far as I'm concerned. So that's how they feel about it. And so I actually changed the title to the Calgary Gay History Project to honor their contributions. And then when I started studying the history of words, of what we call ourselves and what other people call us, I learned that queer was actually owned by the gay community back in the beginning of the 20th century in New York. Like the queer subculture there was, that's how gay people called themselves. So it's funny how it has this, the arc of history or the cycle of history, things change. And I was also super delighted to discover and shocked, I didn't know this, lesbian was, considered really uppity feminist word. And there's a generation of gay women, of the 60s, who, when the 70s came around and sort of the women's movement, really did not want to be called lesbian. They thought it was, pretentious. And they were gay women. And so it's almost like each generation picks the language that they want to use and then carries that forward. And then they're stuck with it, too. They don't want to change. That's very human, too. We like what we like.
Right. And then I guess it's up to the rest of us to listen and to respect those choices.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. That's it for my official questions. Have I missed anything? Is there anything you need to tell me about the Gay History Project or about your perspective on anything? Everything, all the things.
Well, thank you so much for thinking about me and the kind words you said about the book. And I know you don't want me to be too complimentary about the Glenbow, but your former archivist, who's recently retired, Doug Cass, was a huge instrumental help in me putting this book together. I'm not a trained historian. I'm sort of just, stumbling along. And so mentors like Doug and the resources at the Glenbow Archives, I spent many a day up on the sixth floor of the Glenbow doing research, and it was really fundamental for the book. So we need cultural institutions like the Glenbow to support this kind of work.
Thank you. I mean, I think for me, the key is that access and making sure that all these stories and all these objects and items that are important for telling our stories, our local stories, are people from our community that we live and work beside and love. I think that's one of the things that excites me about Glenbow is that it's about access and about really, having a place where you can dig into it and find those stories if you have someone to help you find the way.
Yeah, absolutely.